Hello and welcome to your local anthropologist. I'm your host, Alina, and today we're going to be continuing my series, Utopia of Play, an anthropological lens on the modern workplace. If you've been following my series this far, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope that you're in for a slightly longer episode today, as while I was looking at how to format this, there's just so much information and so much history that deserves to be told, and so today's episode's going to be a little longer, and it's actually going to be in two parts as well. So I hope you're in for this journey. Today we're looking at a history of the commons, the theft of the world, part 1. Enclosure and the colonial export of dispossession. I have mentioned the commons quite a lot throughout this series, about what was enclosed, what was stolen, what we lost. And maybe I've been assuming we all share an understanding of what that actually means, kind of assuming the readers or listeners know what I'm referring to. And so perhaps this particular episode should have appeared much earlier in the series. But we learn, we live, so let's get into it. In order to understand how we ended up trapped in the particular hell of modern work, we need to see exactly what was taken from us and how. So let's talk about the commons, not as distant history, but as the foundation that was deliberately demolished to build the world we're stuck in now. What is meant by the commons? It's a term denoting land and resources managed collectively by a community. It represents one of humanity's most enduring and versatile social institutions. For centuries across Britain, commons regimes provided the material and social bedrock for rural life, sustaining populations through shared use rights to pasture, water, woodlands, and arable land, which is land that can be farmed. The process of enclosure, the legal, economic, and ideological privatization of these common lands, was not merely a change in property law, but a fundamental revolution in social relations. In this first part of a two-part exploration, we'll unpack how the enclosure of the commons changed our relationship to property, dismantled a way of life, and created the landless proletariat necessary for the emergence of industrial capitalism. We'll trace how this class dynamic forged in the English countryside was then exported globally through British colonialism. Understanding this history is essential because the logic of enclosure still lingers, a ghost in the machine of our modern economy, whose contemporary forms we will explore in part 2. A history lesson. In medieval and early modern Britain, the commons was not a lawless free-for-all, but a complex, customarily governed system integral to the manorial economy. The landscape was dominated by open field systems where peasants farmed individual strips of arable land while relying on communally managed waste for essential resources. These use rights were highly specific and included pannage, which was the right to pasture pigs, turbary, which was the right to cut turf for fuel, estivers, the right to take wood for repair or fuel, and the crucial right of gleaning, which is collecting leftover grain after harvest. This system was the lifeblood of the peasant economy, providing a crucial subsistence buffer against hunger and poverty. Now, you've probably heard the phrase, tragedy of the commons. It's this idea that shared resources inevitably get destroyed because people are selfish and will always take more than their share. It's everywhere in economic textbooks, used to justify why everything needs to be privatized or controlled by the state. But is that narrative actually true? Or is it part of a history reinterpreted through the lens of capitalist thinking? Anthropologists and social scientists have shown that shared resources don't automatically fall into chaos or get overused. The idea that individuals will always act selfishly and destroy a shared resource unless it is privatized or strictly controlled by the state needs further examination. The work of political economist Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for her findings, systematically debunks this. She demonstrated that communities are perfectly capable of managing shared resources sustainably through collective action institutions. Not only can they manage this, they often do it better than private owners or state control. Through studying common systems around the world, from Swiss alpine meadows to Japanese forests to irrigation systems in Spain, Ostrom found that successful commons tend to have clear boundaries, people know who's allowed to use the resource, locally appropriate rules, they make sense for the specific conditions, participatory decision-making, everyone gets a say in how things are run, and fair conflict resolution mechanisms. the tragedy of the commons narrative wasn't just wrong, it was useful. It's useful to those who wanted to enclose common lands and turn them into private property. If you can convince people that collective management inevitably fails, that humans are too selfish and short-sighted to share, then privatization starts to look like the only rational solution. The enclosures could be presented not as theft, but as improvement, not as dispossession, but as efficiency. Ostrom's work exposes this for what it was, an ideological justification for one of history's greatest acts of mass expropriation. This might sound impossibly distant from our lives now. Medieval peasants and their pigs seem a long way from the gig economy. But the logic hasn't disappeared. It's just been pushed to the margins, kept alive in the spaces capitalism hasn't fully colonized yet. Think of community-run gardens where neighbors decide together how to share tools, allocate plots, or organize watering. Or open-source software projects like Linux, where thousands of contributors follow shared rules and resolve conflicts collectively without a boss or a profit motive. Even modern co-working spaces often have user-led guidelines about noise, shared equipment, and booking rooms, small-scale commons emerging in the cracks of the market. Before enclosure in England, village life worked in a similar way. Manorial courts and local assemblies acted a bit like community boards. People met, discussed issues, set rules for things like raising animals or collecting firewood, and made sure nobody took more than their fair share. These locally negotiated systems kept the commons functioning for generations, balancing individual needs with the long-term health of the land and community. But the commons was far more than an economic safety net. It was the foundation of an entire way of life. Historians like E.P. Thompson and anthropologist James C. Scott use the term moral economy to describe this world. This was a set of shared norms and social obligations, a deeply held belief that the community had a responsibility to ensure no one fell below a level of subsistence. The commons was the physical stage for this moral economy, the site of communal labor during the harvest, of seasonal festivals, and of the intergenerational transmission of local ecological knowledge. It was, in essence, a socio-ecological system that wove together economic survival, social cohesion, and cultural identity into a resilient whole. But what did this mean in practice? It meant that when harvest time came, the poorest villagers had the right to glean, to walk through the fields after the harvest and collect whatever grain the reapers had left behind. Not as charity, but as a right. It meant that widows and the elderly weren't left to starve. They had claims to community resources. It meant that when grain prices spiked, the community could and would riot, forcing merchants and landlords to sell at a just price rather than profiteering from scarcity. This wasn't naive altruism. It was a practical understanding that the community's survival depended on no one being pushed past the breaking point. Let one family starve, and the whole social fabric begins to tear. Form and function, the purpose of the commons. The multifaceted role of the commons can be understood through how its economic, social, and political functions reinforced each other, creating a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Economically, it was a system of social security, but not in our modern sense of distant bureaucratic aid. For landless cottagers, smallholders, and artisans, commons rights meant the difference between independence and destitution, embedded right in the landscape they moved through daily. A cow on the common could provide milk. A pig fattened on acorns could provide meat for winter. Turf cut from the waste could heat a home. This resource base allowed for a diversified household economy, buffering families from the volatility of grain prices and harvest failures. It was not a system geared toward capital accumulation, but towards subsistence and reproduction, what Scott terms the subsistence ethic, the principle that survival comes before profit, that enough is enough. This type of economic security creates breathing room for social and cultural life to flourish, or what I've been discussing in earlier episodes as play. The rhythms of the agricultural year, plowing, sowing, harvesting, were often communal endeavors, reinforcing social bonds with every shared task. The common land was a space for social interaction, for young and old to mix, for the informal transmission of knowledge about plants, animals, and weather patterns. When you weren't grinding yourself to dust just to survive, when the cow on the common ensured your children wouldn't starve, you had time to participate in harvest festivals, to teach your daughter which herbs healed which ailments, to gather with neighbors and maintain the relationships that made the whole system work. This shared landscape was central to the community's identity, a tangible manifestation of its history and collective rights. And that social cohesion, in turn, underwrote a form of political power that commoners could wield collectively. Politically, the governance of the commons, however imperfect, represented a form of local democracy and negotiation. The manorial court, where use rights were allocated and disputes settled, was a forum where commoners could assert their customary claims. This fostered a sense of collective stewardship and political agency, however limited. When you'd spend the harvest working shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, when you'd resolve conflicts about straying livestock through collective deliberation, you learned that ordinary people had the capacity to govern themselves and their resources. The commons was not a paradise of equality. Social hierarchies existed, women's voices were often marginalized, and the lord still held ultimate legal power. But it did provide a material base for a degree of autonomy from both the landlord and the nascent capitalist market. It was a foundation from which to resist, to make claims, to say, we have rights here, and you cannot simply erase them. The making of enclosures. The systematic dismantling of this world known as enclosure began in earnest in the Tudor period, but accelerated dramatically in the 18th and 19th centuries through parliamentary acts. The motives were overwhelmingly economic and political. The growth of a global wool trade and rising urban populations created lucrative markets for commercial agriculture. Landlords, inspired by the ideology of improvement, sought to consolidate their holdings, replace open fields with enclosed privately owned farms, and convert arable land to more profitable sheep pasture. As Thomas More observed with bitter irony in 1516, sheep are eating men. The profitable wool trade was literally consuming the people who had worked the land for generations. The mechanisms of enclosure were both legal and coercive, but what did this actually look like on the ground? While earlier enclosures were often achieved by straightforward force or local agreement, landlords simply fencing off land and daring commoners to tear the fences down, the Parliamentary Enclosures Acts of the 18th century provided a veneer of legality to what remained at its core systematic theft. Through thousands of these acts, a process driven by and for the land-owning class systematically extinguished common rights. The process went like this. Surveyors would arrive to map and measure. Commissioners, almost always chosen from among the gentry, would adjudicate claims. The land would be divided, hedged, and fenced. Title would be granted to private owners, overwhelmingly the lords of the manor. Imagine waking up one morning to find hawthorn hedges, those dense thorny barriers, planted across paths your family had walked for generations. The patch of waste ground where you'd always cut turf to heat your home through winter, now marked with boundary stones and a sign warning of prosecution for trespass. The common pasture where your cow grazed, providing the milk that kept your children fed, divided up, fenced off, claimed by the lord whose family had always technically owned the land, but never, until now, stopped you from using it. You had no formal title deed, no piece of paper proving ownership. Your right was custom, the fact that your grandparents and their grandparents had always done this. In the new legal order being constructed, custom meant nothing against property. Commoners, whose rights were based on precisely this custom rather than formal title, were frequently dispossessed with minimal or no compensation, even when compensation was offered. It was rarely adequate. You might receive a small plot in exchange for the loss of grazing rights, pannage, turbary, and estivers, but that plot wasn't enough to sustain a family, and it came with new costs. The expense of fencing your allotment, the legal fees associated with the enclosure process itself, the loss of the diversified resource base the commons had provided. These burdens crushed smallholders. Many were forced to sell their land almost immediately, often to the very landlords who had enclosed the commons in the first place. This process was justified by a powerful ideological campaign that we're still living with today. Enlightenment thinkers and agrarian capitalists depicted commoners as lazy, inefficient, and resistant to progress, the same rhetoric used now against anyone who resists the logic of the market. The commons itself was portrayed as wasteful and unproductive, a narrative that directly contradicted its vital role in the subsistence economy. Arthur Young, an influential agricultural writer at the time, looked at common land and saw waste. Commoners looked at the same land and saw winter fuel, summer pasture, medicinal herbs, building materials, and food security. One man's improvement was another family's survival stolen. As anthropologists have shown, enclosure was not just an economic policy, but a cultural project aimed at remaking subjects and landscapes in the image of capitalism. It sought to replace the moral economy of the crowd, with its emphasis on rights and customs, with the political economy of the market, where everything had a price and those without property had only their labor to sell. The hedge became a symbol, a living, thorny reminder that the land was no longer yours, that you were no longer entitled to subsistence by right, only by what you could purchase with wages, if you could find work, if the wages were enough. If. Enclosing the working class, the human impact. The impact of enclosure on the rural population was catastrophic, constituting what Karl Marx termed primitive accumulation, the historical process that divorces the producer from the means of production. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. The loss of common rights amounted to a massive expropriation of wealth from the poor. Without access to pasture, fuel, or game, families lost their means of subsistence. Smallholders, unable to afford the costs of fencing and legal fees associated with enclosure, were often forced to sell their strips, leading to the collapse of the yeoman class. This created a new and vastly expanded class of landless laborers wholly dependent on selling their labor for wages. This transformation of labor relations was the core objective and outcome. As Marx famously described, the process created the great mass of the free proletarians, a workforce with nothing to sell but their own skins. Those scare quotes around free are doing crucial work. These workers had been freed from any means of survival except selling themselves, freed from the land, freed from autonomy, freed into a very particular kind of bondage. This new proletariat faced a brutal buyer's market. With their alternative means of survival eliminated, they had no choice but to accept low wages and precarious, seasonal work in agriculture or to migrate into the burgeoning industrial towns. The autonomy afforded by the commons, the ability to say no to exploitative work because you had other options, was replaced by the discipline of the wage and the direct control of the employer. The social and cultural disruption was equally profound. The breakdown of communal life, the loss of public spaces, and the severing of ties to the land led to widespread social dislocation. The knowledge systems tied to the commons of animal husbandry, forestry, and herbal medicine were rendered irrelevant when people no longer had animals to husband, forests to manage, or land to apply that knowledge to. This forced migration to urban slums created the industrial working class, concentrated and available for exploitation in factories. Resistance was fierce, continuous, and ultimately overwhelmed by the combined force of law, capital, and state violence. This wasn't passively accepted. From the peasant revolts of the 16th century to the diggers' attempted commons reclamation in the 1640s to the Captain Swing riots of the 1830s, commoners fought back. They tore down fences and hedges, sometimes repeatedly, in night raids that became a kind of guerrilla warfare against enclosure. They rioted when grain prices spiked, forcing merchants to sell at traditional just prices. They bought legal appeals, crowdfunding their cases through community networks. They wrote desperate petitions to Parliament, articulating their claims in the language of custom and right. The Captain Swing riots of 1830 and 31 were particularly revealing. Agricultural laborers across southern England rose up, smashing threshing machines, which threatened their winter employment, burning hayricks, and sending threatening letters by the mythical Captain Swing. These actions embodied what E.P. Thompson called the moral economy of the English crowd, the defense of customary rights and the collective enforcement of a just price and fair treatment. The response was brutal. Mass trials, hangings, transportation to Australia. The message was clear. The new order of private property and wage labor would be enforced by violence if necessary. But even in defeat, this resistance mattered. It demonstrated that enclosure was contested, not inevitable. It showed that there was another way of organizing economic life, one that people fought desperately to preserve. And it reminds us that the world we inherited, this world of property and propertylessness, of landlords and landless workers, is not a natural evolution, but a bitter, hard-fought imposition. Theoretical perspectives. There are slight variations in the lenses that social theorists have taken on this enclosure event, and all of them are useful to understand how we ended up with the type of labor relationship we are in today. To fully grasp what enclosure meant and why it still matters, we need to look at it from these multiple angles as they reveal enclosure not as a closed historical chapter, but as an ongoing logic that continues to shape how we work, live, and relate to one another. So let's get into it. As economic foundation. For Karl Marx, enclosure was the foundational act of primitive accumulation, the violent historical process that created the preconditions for capitalism. This was the secret behind the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. You cannot have a system based on wage labor unless you first create a class of people who must sell their labor to survive. Enclosure achieved this by separating people from their means of subsistence, turning them into the free proletariat with nothing to sell but their labor power. But Marx also understood that primitive accumulation wasn't a one-time event in the distant past. It's an ongoing process, repeated whenever capitalism needs to open new frontiers of exploitation. We see it today in land grabs across the global south, in the privatization of public services, in the conversion of knowledge and culture into intellectual property. The mechanism is the same. Take something that was shared or autonomous, fence it off, turn it into private property, and force people to pay for access or do without. Karl Polanyi, writing in The Great Transformation, framed enclosure as part of a broader and more ambitious project, the commodification of land, labor, and money. For Polanyi, these are fictitious commodities, things that were never produced for sale but that capitalism treats as if they were. Land is not produced, it's the earth itself. Labor is not a commodity, it's human life and activity. Yet the market society attempted to organize all life around the buying and selling of these fictions, subordinating society itself into the logic of the market. Polanyi argued this was a utopian and ultimately destructive project. You cannot actually reduce human beings and nature to market commodities without catastrophic social and ecological consequences. We can see contemporary echoes everywhere, in the gig economy where workers' time is fragmented into purchasable units and workers are treated as independent contractors despite having no real independence. In housing markets that treat shelter as an investment vehicle rather than a human necessity, leaving people homeless while luxury apartments sit empty. Polanyi helps us recognize these developments as continuations of a long history of commodification, not as neutral innovations. As destruction of sustainable commons. While Marx and Polanyi show us the forces pushing toward enclosure, Elinor Ostrom's work provides a powerful empirical rebuttal to the ideological justification for enclosure. Remember the tragedy of the commons narrative, the claim that shared resources inevitably fail? Ostrom demonstrated conclusively that this is false, that commons can be and historically have been managed sustainably and equitably, often outperforming both private property and state control. Ostrom's work matters here because it exposes what was lost. Enclosure wasn't replacing a failed system with a successful one, it was destroying functioning sustainable institutions and replacing them with a system oriented towards extraction and accumulation rather than subsistence and reproduction. As state control and legibility. James C. Scott adds another dimension to this. He sees enclosure as part of a broader state and corporate impulse to make populations and landscapes legible, trackable, controllable, and administrable. The open field system, with its complex patchwork of strips and overlapping use rights, negotiated through custom, was a nightmare for state bureaucrats and improving landlords. It couldn't be easily mapped, taxed, or controlled from above. Enclosure simplified the landscape into neat, bounded private properties with clear owners, a landscape you could see from a surveyor's map that could be taxed efficiently, where productivity could be measured and controlled. Scott argues that states and capitalists have a deep need to impose this kind of legibility on messy, organic social systems, even when those systems function well for the people using them. Historically, this meant mapping fields and disciplining peasants into regular wage labor. Today, it appears in algorithmic management, warehouse tracking systems, productivity dashboards, and workplace surveillance technologies that attempt to make every minute of workers' time visible and controllable. Scott's concept of everyday resistance also illuminates contemporary forms of pushback, from gig workers gaming apps to employees quietly subverting monitoring systems. These are the modern equivalents of fence breaking and foot dragging. As gendered violence. Silvia Federici, who I've mentioned in previous episodes, adds an essential feminist dimension, showing that enclosure was not only economic but deeply gendered. In Caliban and the Witch, she demonstrates that the privatization of land went hand in hand with the violent control of women's bodies, labor, and reproductive knowledge. The same period that saw the enclosure of the commons also saw the European witch hunts, which Federici argues were a deliberate campaign to destroy women's autonomy, particularly their control over reproduction and their roles as healers and midwives. As the commons were enclosed, women lost access to crucial resources and to the spaces where they exercised relative autonomy. Simultaneously, new patriarchal norms positioned women's labor, particularly reproductive and care work, as natural, privatized within the household, and therefore not deserving of compensation. The housewife was created alongside the proletarian, both necessary for capitalism, but in different ways. This insight helps us interpret modern struggles around care work, reproductive rights, and the systematic undervaluation of feminized labor as part of the same long arc of enclosure. When we see care work pushed into the private sphere and underpaid, when we see reproductive rights under attack, when we see the second shift of domestic labor falling on women, we're seeing the legacy of this gendered enclosure, certain forms of work and knowledge systematically devalued or made invisible for the sake of accumulation. As bodily discipline. Michel Foucault complements these perspectives by explaining how modern institutions, factories, schools, prisons, hospitals, were designed to produce disciplined, obedient, and efficient workers. His concept of disciplinary power shows how capitalism required not just the enclosure of land, but the enclosure of bodies within new regimes of control. The factory system didn't just require workers, it required a specific kind of worker, one habituated to the clock, to continuous labor, to accepting supervision and hierarchy as natural. This required breaking the irregular work rhythms of the commons, where labor followed seasonal and task-oriented patterns, where Saint Monday was a recognized custom, where workers controlled their own pace. In its place came the discipline of industrial time, the factory bell, the foreman's gaze, the docked wages for lateness, the segmentation of tasks into measurable units. Foucault's insight helps us understand that enclosure operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical land, yes, but also time, movement, knowledge, and bodies. We see this vividly in contemporary workplaces governed by surveillance, technologies, biometric check-ins, productivity scoring, and behavior tracking algorithms. The open plan office, the keystroke monitor, the bathroom break tracked and timed, these are the modern equivalents of the factory's disciplinary architecture. Enclosure as bureaucratic capture. Finally, David Graeber extends this history into the rise of bureaucracy and administrative power. In Debt the First 5,000 Years, Graeber shows how debt has historically been used as a mechanism of social control, a way to colonize the future, and keep people trapped in obligatory relationships. Enclosure often pushed people into debt. They borrowed to pay the legal fees of fighting enclosure, to buy land they'd once used freely, to survive the period between losing the commons and finding wage work. In The Utopia of Rules, Graeber argues that capitalism depends not only on markets, but on vast systems of paperwork, metrics, and institutional hierarchy, what he calls the Utopia of Rules. The commons operated through face-to-face negotiation and customary knowledge. Capitalism replaced this with contracts, employment agreements, performance reviews, and endless documentation. In today's offices filled with performance dashboards, workflow software, and layers of middle management whose primary job seems to be generating reports, Graeber's analysis makes visible how enclosure has morphed into a bureaucratic capture of time, attention, and creativity. Together, these theorists reveal enclosure as a multidimensional process that operated simultaneously on land, labor, gender, bodies, time, and social relations. It was economic, creating propertylessness, political, imposing legibility and control, gendered, devaluing women's work and autonomy, disciplinary, producing docile workers, and administrative, replacing custom with bureaucracy. Understanding all these dimensions helps us to see how the logic of enclosure adapted and persisted, finding new frontiers long after the last common field was hedged. Enclosing the globe, colonialism. The logic of enclosure was not confined to the British Isles. It was a central and brutal instrument of British colonialism, the template for global dispossession. If enclosure in England created capitalism's foundational class relation, a propertied elite and a propertyless proletariat, then colonialism exported this blueprint worldwide, adapting it to different contexts, but always with the same underlying mechanism. Separate people from their means of subsistence, enclose the commons, create dependency on wage labor and commodity markets. Colonialism can be understood in this light as a global project of enclosure, dispossession, and class war. The pattern repeated with horrifying consistency, though the specific methods varied. Let's take a look at how this worked in a few key contexts, because seeing the parallels makes clear this wasn't coincidence or the sum of many local decisions. It was a deliberate, systematic replication of the same logic that had destroyed the English commons. So first up, Ireland, the nearest colony. Ireland offers perhaps the clearest example because it was both geographically close and subject to English-British rule for centuries. The Cromwellian settlements of the 1650s and the subsequent penal laws systematically dispossessed the Gaelic Irish of their land through a process that mirrored English enclosure, but with added layers of ethnic and religious persecution. Traditional Irish rundale systems, a form of commons where land was periodically redistributed among community members, were destroyed and replaced with English-style private estates. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the majority of Irish land was owned by a small Anglo-Irish landlord class, while the Irish themselves had been reduced to tenant farmers on what had once been their own commons, or pushed onto marginal land in the West. The Great Famine of the 1840s revealed the murderous logic of this system. Even as 1 million people starved, Ireland continued to export food to England because the landlord's property rights and profit took precedence over Irish lives. The commons had once provided a buffer against harvest failure. Enclosure and colonial dispossession removed that buffer, turning a natural disaster into genocide. India. Enclosure through revenue systems. In India, the British Raj imposed enclosure not primarily through parliamentary acts, but through land revenue systems that fundamentally transformed the relationship between people and land. The permanent settlement in Bengal created a new class of zamindars, who were landlords that collected revenue for the British out of what had been tax collectors in the Mughal system. Suddenly, these zamindars held something resembling private property rights, while peasants who had cultivated land under various customary arrangements found themselves reduced to tenants. Village commons that had been managed collectively for grazing, fuel, and other resources were either claimed by zamindars or declared state property. The colonial state needed land to be legible, clearly owned, clearly taxable, clearly generating revenue. The complex systems of shared use rights that had sustained Indian villages for centuries were illegible to this administrative logic, so they were swept away. The human cost was staggering. Recurring famines throughout British rule with millions dead as the commons' role as a famine hedge was destroyed by rigid private property and revenue extraction. Settler colonialism, terra nullius and elimination. In settler colonial contexts like Australia, North America, and Kenya, enclosure took its most extreme and violent form. Here, the goal wasn't just to transform existing populations into wage laborers, though that too, but to replace them entirely with settlers. The ideological justification was the doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This was the ultimate enclosure logic. If indigenous peoples' deep, complex, and sustainable relationships with their territories could be legally erased, declared not to constitute proper ownership, then the land could be seized without even the pretense of compensation. As Patrick Wolfe argues, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, an ongoing project oriented toward the elimination of the native and the seizure of land. This was achieved through military violence, yes, but also through legal and administrative mechanisms that mirrored English enclosure. Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed to reserves, a bitter parody of the commons, marginal lands where survival was precarious. Then, to force participation in the colonial economy, hut taxes and pass laws were imposed. Suddenly, to legally exist in what had been your own territory, you needed cash. To get cash, you needed to work for wages on settler farms, in mines, on plantations. The commons had been enclosed. Wage labor became the only option. In Kenya, for example, the colonial government declared vast areas of fertile highlands crown land, evicting Kikuyu, Maasai, and other communities who had used these lands for generations. These lands were then granted to white settlers for commercial farming. The displaced Africans became squatters on their own land, forced to provide labor to the settlers in exchange for the right to cultivate small plots. It was enclosure mapped to racial hierarchy. The English landlord-tenant relation reimposed, with white settlers playing the role of the gentry and Africans cast as landless laborers. The colonial state, managing enclosure through divided rule. Mahmoud Mamdani, yes, you heard that right, it's Zoran Mamdani's father, provides crucial insight into how colonial states manage these enclosed populations. In Citizen and Subject, he describes how colonial powers in Africa created a bifurcated state, customary law for rural subjects, modern law for urban citizens and settlers. This wasn't a preservation of traditional systems, but their deliberate fossilization and manipulation. Customary law was codified, simplified, and administered by colonial-appointed chiefs who had power over their tribal subjects but were themselves subordinate to the colonial state. This system effectively enclosed African populations both physically on tribal reserves and legally within customary authority. It prevented the formation of unified political movements while extracting labor for settler farms and colonial industries. The rural reserves functioned like the post-enclosure English countryside, places that reproduced labor power cheaply. Families could subsist at minimal cost while men were forced to seek wages in settler-controlled sectors. Women's unpaid labor in the reserves subsidized the colonial economy, just as women's unwaged work in the household subsidized industrial capitalism in England. The plantation, perfected enclosure. Perhaps the most complete realization of enclosure logic was the colonial plantation. Here was a factory in the field, a space of total control where enslaved and later indentured laborers, stripped of all autonomy, produced commodities for the global market. The plantation was the commons inverted. Where the commons had been a space of shared use rights and collective survival, the plantation was a space of absolute private property and absolute extraction. The plantation didn't just enclose land, it enclosed bodies, time, movement, and life itself. Enslaved people could not come and go, could not refuse work, could not claim any right to the land they worked on or the crops they grew. Later, when slavery was abolished, indentured labor from India and China replaced it, a system barely distinguishable from slavery, where workers were bound by debt and contract to plantations in the Caribbean, Fiji, Malaysia, and elsewhere. The plantation demonstrates what enclosure looks like when pushed to its logical extreme. Total dispossession, total control, total subordination of human life to the production of commodities and profit. The global class system. What emerged from this global enclosure project was a racialized international division of labor that we still live within. The colonized world became a source of raw materials and cheap labor. The colonizing world became the site of industrial production and capital accumulation, though of course with its own internal class divisions. The commons that had sustained communities across the globe were systematically destroyed, replaced by private property regimes, cash crop production for export, and dependency on global markets. Indigenous knowledge systems of sustainable agriculture, of water management, of forest ecology were dismissed as primitive and replaced with colonial scientific methods oriented towards extraction rather than regeneration. Just as English commoners' knowledge became obsolete once they lost access to the commons, so too did centuries of indigenous ecological wisdom become irrelevant once the land itself had been enclosed and repurposed for colonial profit. This is why we can't understand modern global capitalism without understanding enclosure and colonialism as intertwined processes. The wealth that fueled European industrialization came partly from colonial extraction. The dispossessed populations created by colonial enclosure became sources of cheap labor and captive markets. The racial hierarchies developed to justify colonial violence persist in how labor is valued globally. When we see sweatshops in Bangladesh producing clothes for European markets, when we see land grabs in Africa by multinational corporations, when we see resource extraction that devastates indigenous territories, we're seeing the ongoing logic of colonial enclosure, the same pattern that destroyed the English commons now operating at planetary scale. So, in conclusion, the commons was far more than a collection of shared resources. It was a sophisticated socio-ecological system that sustained forms of social, economic, and political life rooted in reciprocity, obligation, and a moral economy. It provided not just material subsistence, but social cohesion, cultural identity, and a degree of autonomy from both landlords and markets. It was a world where survival didn't depend entirely on selling yourself, where communities maintained some collective control over their conditions of life. Its enclosure was a deliberate and violent act of dispossession that created the modern working class, a landless, dependent proletariat forced to sell its labor under conditions of profound inequality. This process, theorized as primitive accumulation, was not a one-time historical event confined to 16th and 17th century England. It was an ongoing logic of capitalism, perfected in the British countryside and then exported across the globe through colonialism, dispossessing indigenous people from Ireland to India to Kenya to Australia, imposing exploitative labor regimes and creating the racialized global class system we still inhabit. By the 19th century, the stage was set. Millions divorced from the land and concentrated in urban slums and colonial reserves, their survival now dependent entirely on selling their labor power. The hedge had gone up, the fence had been built, and the fundamental class dynamic of the modern world, a propertied elite and a propertyless worker, was locked in place. But this was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the beginning. Enclosure is a logic, a pattern, a process that capitalism returns to whenever it needs new frontiers of accumulation. The physical commons, the fields and forests and pastures, were enclosed centuries ago. But enclosure didn't stop there. It adapted, it evolved, it found new territories to conquer. In part 2, we'll trace how this logic migrated from land into new domains. Time itself became enclosed and sold back to us in hourly increments. Knowledge became intellectual property, fenced off behind patents and paywalls. The workplace became a space of total surveillance and control. Our digital lives became new commons to be mapped, monetized, and enclosed by platform monopolies. We'll explore what some theorists are calling techno-feudalism, the emergence of a new economic system where platform owners extract rent from everyone else's activity, much like feudal lords extracted rent from peasants. But now the manor is Amazon, and the commons being enclosed is human attention, social connection, and creative labor. The hedge became the paywall, the fence became the NDA, the manorial survey became the performance review, the discipline of the factory bell became the discipline of the algorithm, the enclosure of land became the enclosure of life itself. Understanding this history, the destruction of the commons, the creation of the working class, the global export of dispossession, is essential because it reveals that our current conditions are not natural or inevitable. They were made through violence and law and ideology, which means they can be unmade, can be resisted, and can be replaced. The commons existed, it worked, it was destroyed deliberately, and the fight over what gets enclosed and what remains shared, what's privatized and what's collective, what's controlled from above and what's governed by those who use it, that fight never ended, it just moved to new terrain. Thank you so much for listening to Your Local Anthropologist. I'm your host, Alina, and next time we'll continue the history of the commons, looking at new enclosures. I hope you'll tune in. Thank you so much for listening.